Hello, Wellspring.
Okay.
Welcome to Tuesday Talks with Pastor Don and Pastor Jerry. Although I think Wednesday is the new Tuesday because we've come to you on Wednesday the last couple weeks. But it is great to be back with you. And today we want to continue in the Psalms. We dove into the Psalms in our journey through the Bible last Sunday. And we looked particularly at Psalm 22, which is a psalm of lament that David wrote, but Jesus prays. And one of the things that was really interesting about that was the prophetic nature of this psalm. It's 1,000 years before the life of Jesus, and yet it details crucifixion. It details the idea of the people who surrounded the cross and the bedding on Jesus' clothes and all of that. So it's amazing to see such detailed prophecy about Jesus right there in Psalm 22. But we want to focus on this aspect of lament today and even help you learn to do your own work of lament, and how this is a great way to move through difficult times and struggles out to a place of faith and confidence in God. So Psalm 22 begins with this cry from Jesus, my God, why have you forsaken me? And this is a shocking phrase to hear out of the mouth of Jesus, and yet he is the one who prays it. But this is actually deeply rooted in the life of the Jewish believer in Yahweh, the Jewish follower of God. This is a part of their prayer life. It's a part of how they approach God. And laments are a way for us to speak to God out of seasons of deep anguish or pain in our life when we're really struggling. But they're also an expression of faith. And we're going to see that as we walk through this journey. It doesn't sound like lament is faith at first when, God, where are you? You've abandoned me. You've forsaken me. That sounds like doubt, not faith, but it's actually a prayer of faith, and we'll see that as we walk through. It's a great beginning place to connect with God out of seasons of deep pain and grief.
Yeah. And David wrote a lot of the Psalms, and he wrote them in his often in distress. David was chased by Saul and the Philistines, and he was betrayed by his family.
Yes.
And he battled with his own sins. So he writes these psalms out of the pain and the struggles that he is in at the moment. And we're going to look at Psalm 13 today, which David wrote. And it says, "How long, Lord, will you forget me forever? How long will you hide your face from me? How long must I wrestle with my thoughts and day after day have sorrow in my heart? How long will my enemy triumph over me? Look on me and answer, Lord my God. Give light to my eyes, or I will sleep in death, and my enemy will say, I have overcome him, and my foes will rejoice when I fall. But I trust in your unfailing love. My heart rejoices in your salvation. I will sing the Lord's praise, for he has been good to me."
Yeah, so we chose this psalm because it's a short lament of David. He wrote many of them. Some are much longer. But it's really a way for us to get a hold of this process of lament and to learn how do we talk to God out of deep emotional pain and stress. So there are three movements in this little psalm that help us to think about the process of lament. And the first is David asked this question, where are you, God? And actually 4 times he uses the question, how long? How long will you forget me? How long will my enemies triumph over me? How long is this going to go on? So it's kind of this idea of I can't take it anymore. And this comes out of David's life situation. So he begins where he's at. He begins in the pain and in the struggle, and he offers up what we call the complaint of faith. He presents his situation to God, and he cries out, where are you? So then the second movement, he begins to move from where are you, God, to his request. So he says, come help me, God. And he starts to talk about how the situation is too big for him. The enemies are triumphing over him. Death is encroaching upon him. His difficulty is overwhelming, and he acknowledges his great need. He acknowledges his own inability to solve this problem himself. If God doesn't intervene, then he's going to be wiped out by this situation. And so the second movement then of lament is come and help me, God. We start with our life situation. We start with where are you, God? We move to come help me, God. And then the third movement is I trust you, God. And in this section, David begins to say, I trust in your unfailing love. He starts to think about and look at the character of God and to particularly think about how has God worked in my life in the past? Where have I seen him be faithful in my life and the lives of others? And I'll just take a moment here and do a little aside. This is one of the reasons I always encourage Christians: read the biographies of great Christians. Read the stories of people who have walked in the faith before us, because many of them suffered great difficulties and they testify to how God was faithful. I know in my own journey, the way I get to this third step of lament often is to think about men and women who have gone before me, like Corrie ten Boom or John Wesley or Billy Graham, even people more recent. Like, how did they navigate the difficult times of their life? What testimonies did they write about? And that helps us to begin to trust God. So in these three movements of lament, starting with our life situation, where are you, God? And then come help me, God. And then I trust you, God. There are four words to just keep in mind. The first is honesty. The second is process. The third is faith. And the fourth is praise. So how do we think about these words, Dawn?
So honesty is being honest. When you come to God with your lament and what you're struggling with, be honest with him and say it out. Don't be worried about what language you use. Don't be worried about, I have to say the right thing or he's not going to listen to me. Just be honest with him and just say what it is that's on your heart.
Yeah. So sometimes we say, don't sanitize your prayer. Don't sanitize your lament. Listen to Jesus. My God, why have you forsaken me? God has abandoned me. David, how long, O Lord, will you forget me forever? Well, this is pretty strong language, and they don't try to soften it. They don't censor it. They don't filter it through their mind. Instead, they cry out right from their heart, their pain. And that's the honesty we're talking about. That's where lament begins. Lament is the guttural cry of our soul, and that's where we begin. So, and then we want you to think about process. So lament is this journey, if you will. It's almost like a mini pilgrimage from the pain to the place of faith and hope and expectation. So there's a process, and a big part of the process can be writing it down. And if this isn't a pattern you're into, we encourage you to get into it, because this is how we have these laments of David. He wrote them down, and then Jesus was able to access them, memorize them, and use them in his own life, and so are we. And there's actually something really visceral about putting it on paper. There's something powerful about the tactile experience of taking a pen or a pencil in your hand. I encourage you, don't do it on your computer. Take a pen or pencil and write it down. Sometimes even how you write the words are a part of getting it out. If you make it really dark or really large, to just express your emotion. But there's something about this process of getting it from inside of us out into the pen, through our hand, onto the paper. So there's a process, and I encourage you to write. And this is time. Now, in Psalm 13, we read through it in just a moment. It can happen in a short time. For some of us, this could be a long stretch. We might sit in the lament phase. We might sit in the where are you, God phase for quite a while, and then we start to write it down, and we get it out of our soul and onto the paper. So that's the process.
So the next process is faith. And when we look at it, we think complaint of faith, where the object is God. So you've brought it to him, you've been honest with him, and you've said, here's what it is, and where are you, whatever your language is. And then you realize your trust in God, who God is, and you verbalize that. And you might even remind yourself of his faithfulness. Like maybe look back on your past, something that had happened to you before, where you see that God showed up and he was there. And then name him like God of, healing, and God of protection, God of preservation, or whatever, perseverance, whatever it is that brings you to faith in who he is.
So that's part of the process, right? Is moving your focus off of the circumstance, off of your pain, and onto God. That's why we call it the complaint of faith, since he's the object of our concern, our complaint. So great. And then the fourth word we encourage you to think about is praise. And this is where we begin to intentionally verbalize our trust and our confidence out loud to God. We begin to exalt him for who he is. And this is kind of that final phase of getting off of us and off of the struggle and off of how big our enemies are and off of how long this has lasted and how painful it's been, and onto God himself, onto the source, onto the lover of our souls, the shepherd who guides us, the protector, the defender, the warrior, all those words that we can begin to pray and to just declare his goodness, declare his praise. So we're going to move into the last section of this by trying to help you think about writing your own lament. And this is a process that all believers should learn and work on. You may say, well, I'm not in a place of deep lament right now, and that's okay, but you will be. And it doesn't have to be necessarily some huge, overwhelming thing where I'm just so filled with pain. This is a great way to process if we've been hurt, if we've been betrayed, if somebody's talked about us at work, if we're confused by a situation. Lament is a great way to process those feelings, bring them to God, and move off of that and on to faith. Because we know that God calls us to live lives of trust in him, and we want to be people who are living out of faith and not fear. But I think sometimes Christians shortchange the process, and that's why we use that word process, because we're like, well, I got to jump right to forgiveness. Well, you do need to forgive, but if you don't process your feelings and your emotions, if you don't walk through this journey, if you don't feel it deeply, maybe even get it out on paper, a lot of times we shortchange the process, and then we say, well, I've forgiven, or I've laid that down, or I gave that to God. But then in your conversation, in your mind, in your prayer times, it keeps coming up and keeps coming up. And it's a reminder to us that no, we need to work through this, and that's okay, because Jesus did and David did, and then that helps us to get out to the place where we want to be. So here are some phrases, here are some ways that we want to help you start to think about these three categories of lament. So the first is, where are you, God? So Dawn, what are some ways that we might borrow from David's language and Jesus' language to start to talk about?
Yeah, so some of the phrases that you could start with is, why did you allow this to happen? So whatever it is that you're taking in, why did you allow it to happen? And really just wait for him, to maybe kind of answer that or to work through you in that. Another phrase you could use is this ever going to change? Yeah. And I think that's a good question, is it ever going to change? And then another one is, I'm so sick of this. Because it could be just that you're tired of dealing with it and you're done. That's why you're lamenting.
Yeah, so that's some of that, a little bit of that uncensored language, right? I'm sick of this. I'm sick and tired of how this person treats me. I'm really sick of being under the weight of financial stress all the time. And so this is that uncensored language. And even now we're not really using harsh words as we talk to you, but sometimes you can. You might need to say, hey, this really sucks. And that's not the language we normally use, and it's not something we want to go necessarily throwing around in our conversations. But if you're going to really lament, if you're going to say, this is what I feel inside, then that's the way of saying it. And, Pastor Don was saying, wait on God to answer. His answer isn't always, well, let me explain this. Sometimes it's just, I'm here for you. Yeah. So the second section then would be, come help me, God. So what are some phrases that we might use to get into this section, Dawn?
Yeah. So one of the phrases you could start with is, I can't fix. Knowing that you can't fix it. That's why you're bringing it to God. So just admitting that, you can't fix it. You're my only hope for, and just letting him know, I'm coming to you because I truly feel that you are, and I believe that you are my only hope. Yeah. To help me in this. And then another one is, I'm being crushed by. That one is...
Yeah, that touches close to home, doesn't it? Yeah, so I'm being crushed by the weight of this burden, this grief, this pain, this illness that I'm experiencing, or this individual who just keeps making my life so difficult. Yeah. And so, it helps us to say, this puts us in the posture of humility. I recognize that, God, unless you act, I'm lost. You need to act in my situation here. Boy, this is really then getting in touch with faith. Okay, God, we're coming to you saying we need you. Yeah. And then the last section would be, I trust you, God. So what are some phrases we can use to move into this third part of lament?
Yeah, so one of the phrases you can say is, your name is,
Mm.
and, recognize that, what does his name mean? Like, what do you call him? What do you rely on him? Like, your name is all powerful. Your name is greater than anything. Your name is, and then, put that in there. Another phrase is, you have always blank. This one reminds me of a woman that's in our church. I like to say she's a young lady. She's in her 90s. And it doesn't matter what she goes through, what she's struggling with, where she's walking. She always ends that complaint, and so to speak, with, but the Lord has always been good to me.
Yeah.
And like, if you go to him and you've poured out your heart and said all of these things, and then you say, you have always been good to me. Like, that's a statement of faith, and that touches my heart every time that she speaks it out. So
for sure.
Yeah. And then another one is, I know you are. I know you are, healer, provider, sustainer, whatever it is that you're feeling inside, to just allow God to know who you know he is.
David in Psalm 13 says, I trust in your unfailing love. So he's reminding himself that God's character is faithful and that his love doesn't fail, that his steadfast covenant promises are true. So yeah, in just wrapping this up then, part of what we see from the life of David and from Jesus on the cross that we learned about on Sunday is the permission to lament. So often as Christians we think, well, we always have to talk nice, and I'm not saying that we get to go around attacking people, but you understand what I mean. We're always supposed to use certain words, and we have to forgive people, and we can't be sitting in worry or doubt or fear. Those things are true, but there's a process to get there, and it starts with honesty. It starts with saying, right now I feel like crud. Right now I don't feel all these Christian virtues and these Christian responses, and we take that to God, just like Jesus did, just like David did. And we start there, and then we go through these movements of going from, where are you, God, to come and help me, God, crying out and writing that down, letting it come out of our soul onto the paper, and then presenting it to God in faith, like, I know who you are, you're faithful, I trust you. And keep this in mind, all of these praises come out in lament before the deliverance. This isn't after they've been rescued. This is the same prayer. In the same prayer, they've moved from fear to faith by walking this spiritual process. And so they start to exalt God and praise him even before the deliverances come. And I would just suggest this in closing, that one of the things we do in healing care, sometimes we do this in our prayer times with the staff team, we've certainly done it with our family in our house, is we have a kind of a rough cross that we've made. It's like 3x2, and we'll set that cross up and read our lament right out in front of the cross. Allow that visible symbol to help us connect with the suffering Savior Jesus, with the fact that he's acquainted with sorrow and grief, and he walks by us in our suffering. If you don't have something like that, or even a small cross that you can hold or use, close your eyes and picture being in front of the cross of Christ. Cry your lament out there in front of the cross, and then leave it with him. Now, there's several things you can do with it. Some people like to destroy a lament when they're done with it. Others keep it so they can return and read it at another time and say, wow, God really walked with me through that. Nevertheless, what we want to just say to you today is lament is the language of faith. It's part of the Christian journey, and it's okay to walk this path. In fact, it's necessary to walk this path. The great King David did it. Jesus did it. We see examples of it in James and Paul. And so, put this practice into your life, and you will see that out of the deepest and darkest spaces, it's actually a great place to connect with God and grow in your faith. God bless you, Wellspring. Have a great week.